Okay, so just picking up where I left off, I did tell you guys to make sure you guys can distinguish and know the difference between the classical position and the position it maintains and the positivist. The classical position, they maintain that punishment should fit the crime and nothing else. That is that all people convicted of similar crimes should receive the same punishment regardless of any differences that they may have. Okay, when it comes to the positivist position, they maintain that punishment should fit the offender and be appropriate to rehabilitation. So picking up from there and moving on to Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham, I did discuss towards the end of the first part of this lecture, but now we're going to talk about how Jeremy Bentham is able to create a bridge between the classical and the positivist school and ways of thought. Estimates of the values of pleasure and pain are to be considered with reference to 4 circumstances. These 4 circumstances are similar to that of Beccari's 3 elements of punishment. Okay, these 4 circumstances, according to Jeremy Bentham, are intensity, somewhat meaning severity, duration, certainty, and propinquity. Okay, propinquity meaning how soon after the crime, pleasure, or pain is forthcoming. Okay, so in expressing those views, Jeremy Bentham added to Beccari's insight by showing how they cohered with nature, with human nature as classical scholars viewed it at the time. He also devoted an entire chapter, a fragment of government, or a fragment on government, to 32 biological, psychological, and social factors he thought of as circumstances influencing sensibilities. Cartographic criminology, so going further into positivism and seeing how positivism branches out and expands. Cartographic criminology, what are cartographers? First of all, cartographers are scholars who employ maps and other geographic information in their research. Cartographic criminology is an early version of modern crime mapping. In chapter 2, measuring crime and criminal behavior, you were introduced to geographic information systems, GIS. So this is the way that we map crime today in the United States. GIS is actually used worldwide. The first publication of detailed statistics relating to criminal activity for an entire country occurred in France in 1827, more than 100 years before the publication of the first edition of the Uniform Crime Reports, the UCR, in the United States. You should familiarize yourselves with Henry Matthew as well as Joseph Fletcher. They mapped out concentration of various kinds of criminal activity across England and Wales using British crime data from the 1830s and into the 1840s. They were influenced by Gary as well as Quetelet. Gary, first of all, noted that the overall level of wealth in a region, so it wasn't necessarily England, it wasn't Wales, but they noticed in various regions a similar pattern. So they noted that the overall level of wealth in a region does not necessarily correspond to the level of wealth among all its citizens. That being poor, so a person being poor amid riches, not being poor per se, is the condition that produces the most misery. Quetelet thought sociologically about crime before the discipline officially existed, writing that society prepares the crime, and the guilty is only the instrument by which it is accomplished. Moving on to biological positivism and Cesar Lombroso. Okay, Lombroso is widely acclaimed as the father of modern criminology. Lombroso's book, Criminal Man, is the first book devoted solely to the causes of criminality ever written. The concept of atavism highlights an important point of difference between the classical and the positivist schools. Okay, While, yes. So while the classics view criminals and non-criminals as essentially similar beings with they're similar beings, but who chose different pathways in life, positivists viewed them as being quite different. Although insane criminals bore some stigmata, they were not born criminals. Rather, they become criminals as a result of an alteration of the brain, which completely upsets their moral nature. Among the ranks of Lombroso's insane criminals are alcoholics, nymphomaniacs, kleptomaniacs, and child molesters. Okay. Criminaloids had none of the physical peculiarities of the born or insane criminal and were considered less dangerous. And lastly, I do want to say in relation to the last slide that just passed by, Lombroso also categorized, categorized these types of criminals as well. Okay, so those who are categorized as habitual criminals are those who become so by contact with other criminals through the abuse of alcohol or even distressing circumstances. You're classified, according to Lombroso, as a judicial criminal if you fall afoul of the law, specifically by accident. And then you're categorized as a criminal by passion if you're hot-headed and an impulsive person who commits a violent act when provoked. Okay, moving on to Garofalo, natural crime and offender peculiarities. Okay, Garofalo, who coined the term criminology in 1885, is perhaps best known for his efforts to formulate a natural definition of crime. Garofalo's natural crimes are evil in themselves. So remember from chapter 1, an overview of crime and criminology. If you're the person is evil in themselves, remember that's associated with mala in se. Whereas other kinds of crime, mala prohibita, are wrong only because they have been made wrong by law. Garofalo's 4 categories of criminals and their punishments are also listed, okay? There are extreme, impulsive, professional, and endemic. Extreme, again, is swiftly executing them. Impulsive is the imprisonment of them. Professional, the elimination of them. And then endemic, mala prohibita. Okay. Moving on to Enrico Fury, okay, and social defense. Again, we're still in the rise of positivism. Fury, like Garofalo, dismissed the notion of free will as a myth, and he derived the same policy implications from its dismissal. Pre-positivistic notions of culpability, moral responsibility, and intent were to be subordinate to an assessment of the offender's strength of resistance to the criminal impulse with the express purpose of averting future danger to society. Social defense, as rational for punishment, asserts that its purpose is not to deter or to rehabilitate, but to defend society from criminal predation. Okay. Now, deterrence and choice, pain versus gain. And in this chapter, we do start off with a couple of definitions, okay? And it's important to know the difference between specific and general deterrence, etc. So deterrence is the prevention of criminal acts by the use or threat of punishment and may be either specific or general. Specific deterrence refers to the effect of punishment on the future behavior of the person who experiences the punishment and underpins the concept of recidivism and contrast effect. General deterrence is the preventative effect of the threat of punishment on the general population. That is potential offenders like you and I, okay? Moving on to perpetual deterrence theory. Perpetual deterrence theory is concerned with how individuals respond to the perceived as opposed to objective cost properties of their criminal decisions, okay? A criminal's awareness of punishments for crime, if caught, leads to increased or decreased probabilities of being apprehended or changes in the severity of the punishment for a given crime. Okay, so again, we cannot determine from the correlation between raw incarceration rates and dropping crime rates if we're witnessing a deterrent or a deterrent effect or an incapacitation effect. There does seem to be a modest inverse relationship between the perceived certainty of punishment and crime, but no real evidence of deterrent effects for severity and no real knowledge base about the celerity of punishment. Deterrence and the death penalty. So kind of closing up the chapter, okay? Many studies have looked at homicide rates in neighboring states with and without the death penalty, or homicide rates before and after abolition. The deterrent effect of punishment is taken for granted by economists, but most criminologists are sociologically trained and tend to be either agnostic about human nature or deny that such a thing exists. 88.2% of criminologists agreed that the death penalty was not a deterrent to further murder, and 63% of police chiefs have disagreed with the statement that the death penalty significantly reduces the number of homicides. Okay. The CDDP concludes that research on the effect of capital punishment on homicides is not informative. Okay. So what about deterrence? Is the United States hard or soft on crime? Okay. And again, as I've said, sorry, my phone. Do not bypass the charts. They are important and you guys should look at them. So here we have deterrence and the death penalty, specifically murder rates in states with and without the death penalty. Blue are the states, are death penalty states, so states with the death penalty, and in the green, states without the death penalty. So again, you know, is the death penalty, or does the death penalty seem to be a deterrent? Okay, and with the amount of deaths, and I do believe it's the amount of deaths, murder rates in states with the death penalty. The murder rates in Louisiana are high, okay? So it seems that, you know, having the threat of the death penalty and looking at the classical school, right? And we're thinking about Beccaria, right? You know, the death penalty is supposed to be a deterrent. And it actually doesn't seem to be working, at least not in Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, South Carolina. I can say for sure those, right? We can say for sure those. However, the states in the middle, and by the middle, you guys might not understand what I'm saying, so I'll just point them out. Nevada, Delaware, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, Arkansas, North Carolina, and then move down to Maryland, Alaska, Michigan, Illinois. Let's include New Mexico. I couldn't tell you there whether or not the death penalty is actually working, but I can tell you in places like New Hampshire, Vermont, Minnesota, Maine, Hawaii, Oregon, Idaho, Utah. You guys, I just listed off a mixture of states that have lower murder rates, and some of them have death penalty and some of them don't. So what it actually seems to be is that there really is no concrete evidence on whether or not the death penalty is a deterrent, and it actually looks like it is not a significant deterrent. Okay? Because we do have quite a few. If we say that three murders in a state was like the threshold, then the death penalty is definitely not like a significant factor. Okay? So, I mean, pause and look at that for yourself, and you decide, you know, is the death penalty a deterrence? Okay. So what about deterrence? Is the US hard or soft on crime? The United States is perceived to be soft on crime. And therefore its punishments are not likely to have much of a deterrent effect. The numbers do not support the perception because the United States has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. In terms of alternative punishment or the conditions of confinement, the United States is, again, soft on crime. The effects of deterrence depend far more on the certainty and swiftness of punishment, not the severity, and most assuredly on the contrast effect. So, I mean, that graph that we just saw is definitely an image of that. Okay, so it might work. I mean, if we're talking about 2020 today, again, you know, when we're talking about defunding the police, and I'm not saying whether or not I agree with defunding, but I do think that we should be looking at if we are to make the criminal justice system better, right? Let's look more at swiftness. So getting people to see the magistrate or the judge as quick as possible and serving out that punishment, right? And the certainty, clarifying the punishment, right? Clarifying that, you know, this is the charge. If you do this, this is the charge, okay? And again, here's another graph. So what about the deterrence in the United States, soft or hard? Incarcerated, this is a graph or figure of incarceration rates per 100,000 population for selected countries, okay? Again, as we know, the United States incarcerates the most people in the world, okay? And again, this is per 100,000 population. So the United States, those that are incarcerated, 655 per 100,000. Cuba, 510 per 100,000. Okay, Russia, Chile, Saudi Arabia, England and Wales. Okay. Also, I do want to say that most of us, if you are in this class already, you should know that our prison system is very different than a lot of these countries, very different, okay? Where some of these countries actually treat some of these crimes, and we haven't gotten into this like specific crimes, but certain crimes as more illnesses in some of them, okay? And not necessarily, you know, crimes, but, you know, illnesses. These people need help, etc. Lastly, our section on the evaluation, one of the last sections on the evaluation of the classical and early positivist schools. The classical school was a school of philosophical jurisprudence bent on establishing a set of reformist moral values in criminal justice, not a school of empirical data collection and analysis attempting to build a theory of criminality. Because it embraces scientific principles, the positivist school is highly influential in criminology today. Okay. Lastly, policy and prevention, implications of the deterrence theory. The swiftness aspect would certainly run up against constitutional issues in a system purposely designed to make it as difficult as possible to convict suspects. Many states started putting more and more offenders behind bars for longer periods and implemented mandatory sentencing laws in the 1980s, but soon after found their prisons so overcrowded that courts intervened. This resulted in the repeal of some states' mandatory sentencing laws and the institution of early release programs. CompStat employs computer-based systems that map crime to geographic areas and identify problems, thus enabling police administrators to devise strategies and tactics to reduce crimes and solve a variety of other problems. However, to take full advantage of this system requires well-trained and educated administrative police officers and sufficient manpower to implement the strategies and tactics devised. Okay. So again, some of the things that I just mentioned and that we've gone over when it comes to policy and prevention and implications of deterrence theories. We've moved from looking at severity, and now we're looking at, you know, more of swiftness, certainty, and swiftness. Okay, so certainty versus swiftness and severity. So certainty is definitely top on the list. There are some constitutional issues, especially in regards to repealing the repealing of sentencing laws and how long individuals stay in prison for specific types of crimes. And then CompStat has been successful in crime reduction. So this specifically in mapping crime specifically to geographic areas and aiding police departments in implementing strategies and tactics to lessen crime in their areas. So that is lecture 4. I'm sorry it took so long to get that out. Again, a lot of students do not have books. And yeah, so there's 4. Okay, I'll see you guys later. Have a good one.